The year is 391 of the Common Era, and smoke rises from the greatest repository of human knowledge the ancient world has ever known. In the heart of Alexandria, a city that has stood as a beacon of learning for nearly 7 centuries, mobs surge through marble streets with torches in hand. What unfolds in these terrible months will not merely destroy buildings of stone and papyrus, will sever humanity's connection to countless works of philosophy, science, literature, and mathematics forever lost to the flames of religious zealotry. This is the story of how civilization's brightest light was systematically extinguished. To understand the catastrophe that befell Alexandria, one must first grasp the magnificence of what was lost. When Alexander the Great founded the city in 331 before the Common Era, he envisioned more than a mere port. His successors, the Ptolemaic pharaohs, transformed this vision into reality. Ptolemy I Soter established the Mausoleum, the Temple of the Muses, and its legendary library, which would become the intellectual heart of the ancient world. At its zenith, the Great Library of Alexandria housed an estimated 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls. Every ship entering Alexandria's harbor was required to surrender any manuscripts aboard for copying. The originals were kept, and copies returned to their owners. Through this aggressive acquisition policy, Alexandria accumulated the written wisdom of Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Hebrew, and Babylonian civilizations. Within its columned halls walked some of history's most brilliant minds. Euclid composed his elements here, establishing the foundations of geometry that would endure for millennia. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy using nothing but shadows and mathematics. Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system 17 centuries before Copernicus. Archimedes studied here before returning to Syracuse. The physician Herophilos conducted the first systematic dissections of human cadavers, advancing anatomical knowledge by centuries. According to historian Diana Delia's research on Ptolemaic Alexandria, the Mausoleum functioned as the world's first state-sponsored research institution, where scholars received salaries, free meals, and lodging to pursue knowledge for its own sake. But Alexandria was more than its library. The city itself represented a revolutionary experiment in cosmopolitan coexistence. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Persians, and later Romans lived in designated quarters, yet shared the agora, the theater, and the great lighthouse, the fairest one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This mingling produced syncretic religions, hybrid artistic styles, and unprecedented intellectual exchange. Yet beneath this surface, harmony festered deep tensions. The Greek-speaking elite dominated political and economic life. Native Egyptians, though numerically superior, occupied lower social strata. The substantial Jewish community, concentrated in the Delta Quarter, maintained their distinct identity while engaging in constant negotiation with their pagan neighbors. These divisions, manageable during prosperous times, would prove catastrophic when external pressures mounted. The first great blow to Alexandria came not from religious conflict, but imperial ambition. In 48, before the Common Era, Julius Caesar found himself besieged in the palace quarter. To prevent enemy ships from trapping his fleet, he ordered the harbor set ablaze. The fire spread to warehouses near the docks containing an estimated 40,000 scrolls awaiting export. This was devastating, but not fatal. The main library complex survived intact. The city endured subsequent upheavals. Emperor Aurelian's reconquest in 272 destroyed the Bruchium quarter, likely damaging portions of the Mausoleum. Yet scholars continued their work. The institution adapted, diminished, but defiant. What finally killed Alexandria's intellectual tradition was not warfare, but theology. And that deadly transformation began when Constantine the Great made Christianity the empire's favored religion, setting in motion forces that would culminate in the horror of 391. By the middle of the 4th century, Alexandria had become a battleground for the soul of the Roman Empire. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, now wielded imperial power. But this ascendant faith was itself fractured by bitter theological disputes. Alexandria stood at the epicenter of these conflicts, producing both the orthodox champion Athanasius and the heretical priest Arius, whose competing visions of Christ's divine nature tore congregations apart and brought imperial armies to enforce doctrinal conformity. The transformation of religious authority fundamentally altered Alexandria's social fabric. Christian bishops accumulated unprecedented power. They commanded not merely spiritual allegiance, but economic resources and, crucially, organized paramilitary forces. The Parabolani, originally charitable workers who tended the sick, evolved into a private army numbering perhaps 800 men, answerable only to the patriarch. More fearsome still were the monks who streamed from desert monasteries into the city, their ascetic fanaticism barely containable by ecclesiastical authority. Paganism, meanwhile, retained powerful adherents. The ancient temples still functioned, their priests still performed sacrifices. The philosophical schools, particularly the Neoplatonist academies, continued training students in traditions. Stretching back to Plato and Pythagoras, the Serapeum, the great temple of Serapis that also housed a daughter library of the Mausian, dominated Alexandria's Acropolis. This magnificent structure, with its 100 steps ascending to columned halls, symbolized everything Christians had been taught to despise. The prefect of Egypt, Evagrius, and his successor, Romanus, attempted to maintain civil order and protect pagan institutions. But imperial policy increasingly favored Christian interests. Emperor Constantius II had forbidden sacrifices. Emperor Julian the Apostate briefly restored pagan privileges. Jovian and Valentinian pursued inconsistent courses. This vacillation created dangerous uncertainty. Each community believed it might soon triumph. Into this volatile situation stepped Theophilus, elected Patriarch of Alexandria in 385. Unlike his predecessors, Theophilus combined theological certainty with political cunning and personal ambition that recognized no limits. He understood that destroying paganism would consolidate Christian power, enrich the church through confiscated temple treasures, and establish his own authority as unchallengeable. Theophilus began cautiously, petitioned Emperor Theodosius I for permission to convert a neglected Mithraeum into a church. Permission granted, his workers discovered the underground sanctuary's ritual objects. Rather than quietly disposing of these items, Theophilus paraded them through Alexandria's streets in deliberate mockery. Pagan worshippers, outraged by this desecration, responded with violence. Street fighting erupted. Blood flowed in gutters that had known such conflict too many times before. The pagan response played into Theophilus's hands. Seeking refuge, a substantial number of pagans and philosophers barricaded themselves within the Serapeum's massive walls. They took Christian hostages. Some sources claim they forced captured Christians to offer sacrifice or face execution. The standoff presented Theophilus with his opportunity. He dispatched messengers to Constantinople, describing the situation in terms calculated to inflame imperial anger. Christians persecuted, pagans defiant, the honor of the true faith at stake. Theodosius, already inclined toward religious uniformity, responded with a fateful decree. The emperor ruled that the Christian martyrs of the street fighting were blessed, their killers damned, and crucially, that the Serapeum and all its contents were forfeit to the church. Armed with imperial sanction, Theophilus gathered his forces. Soldiers, monks, Parabolani, and Christian mobs converged on the temple. The pagans within, abandoned by civil authorities, faced an impossible choice. They could die defending their sacred space, or surrender and watch its destruction. Most chose flight, slipping away in darkness. When dawn broke over Alexandria in 391, the great doors stood undefined at. What followed would haunt humanity forever. The doors of the Serapeum gave way with a sound like thunder echoing across centuries. Christian forces surged into the temple precinct, their shouts of triumph mingling with the crash of falling idols. At the heart of the complex stood the colossal statue of Serapis himself, a masterwork of ivory. Precious metals and sacred wood that had inspired worship and wonder for 600 years. A soldier, perhaps emboldened by fear that the god might strike him down, took an axe to its face. When no divine vengeance materialized, the mob's hesitation transformed into frenzy. They tore the statue apart piece by piece. The golden limbs were stripped away, the ivory panels were pried loose. The wooden core was dragged through the streets and burned in the amphitheater while crowds jeered. Throughout the empire, Christians interpreted this desecration without consequence as proof of their faith's supremacy. The old gods were shown to be nothing mere wood and metal without power. But the physical destruction of the Serapeum represented only part of the catastrophe unfolding that terrible year. Within the temple complex stood one of the ancient world's great libraries, the so-called daughter library of the original Mausian, Stimmetsveri. But this collection likely contained tens of thousands of scrolls, copies of texts from the main library, unique manuscripts acquired over centuries, and the accumulated research of generations of scholars. The mobs did not discriminate between religious artifacts and philosophical texts. To the zealots flooding through the colonnaded halls, all of it represented the old world that must be swept away. Scrolls were torn, trampled, scattered. Some were deliberately burned, others simply abandoned to decay in the chaos. The loss was incalculable, works of Sappho surviving nowhere else, treatises of Aristotle now known only by title, scientific texts whose absence would retard human progress by a millennium. The destruction spread beyond the Serapeum. Throughout Alexandria, pagan temples fell to organized demolition. Caesarium, once dedicated to the imperial cult, was converted to a church. Smaller shrines were simply razed. The philosophical schools, though not directly targeted, lost their institutional support in physical spaces. Scholars who had taught openly now found themselves suspect, their lectures interrupted by hostile crowds, their students afraid to be seen attending. The terror extended to individuals. Pagan priests were killed, beaten, or forced to flee. Philosophers learned to guard their words. Those who persisted in traditional practice did so secretly, behind closed doors, aware that any neighbor might inform the bishop's agents. The cosmopolitan city that had welcomed all seekers of wisdom now enforced a single truth with the sword. Yet Theophilus was not satisfied with mere destruction. He sought to demonstrate that the old knowledge was not only impious, but powerless. He ordered workers to measure the Nile's rise using traditional methods, then announced that Christian prayers had improved the flood, a claim that would have been laughable to any scientist of the Mausian era, but now went unchallenged. He repurposed temple stones for church construction, embedding pagan blocks in Christian walls as trophies of conquest. The physical transformation of Alexandria mirrored its intellectual collapse, where the Serapeum's columns had reached toward heaven. Now only rubble remained. Churches rose on sacred sites, their architecture deliberately obscuring what came before. The great lighthouse still stood, but it no longer illuminated a city of learning. It marked instead a port of commerce and conflict, its symbolic meaning hollowed out like the statues Theophilus had smashed. Some scholars escaped. They carried what manuscripts they could to Athens, Constantinople, Antioch, and eventually to Persian academies, where Greek learning would survive in translation. These refugees represented the diaspora of classical knowledge, their flight ensuring that some portion of ancient wisdom endured. But what they saved constituted mere fragments of what had existed. The Mausian itself, already weakened, now entered its final decline. 24 years after the Serapeum's destruction, Alexandria witnessed an act of violence that would symbolize for all subsequent ages the murder of classical learning by Christian fanaticism. Her name was Hypatia, and her death in the year 415 marked the end of Alexandria's intellectual tradition more definitively than any burning building. Hypatia was the daughter of Theon, the last known scholar associated with the Mausian. She had studied mathematics, astronomy, and Neoplatonist philosophy, achieving renown throughout the Mediterranean world. Students traveled from distant provinces to hear her lecture. Dressed in the distinctive cloak of philosophers, she moved freely through Alexandria's streets, commanding respect from pagans and Christians alike. Her intellectual achievements were remarkable. She edited and commented on mathematical texts, designed astronomical instruments, and taught a method of philosophical inquiry that transcended sectarian boundaries. Her students included Christians of high standing, among them Synesius of Cyrene, who would become a bishop while maintaining devoted correspondence with his pagan teacher. This capacity to bridge religious divides made Hypatia exceptional in an age of increasing polarization. It also made her dangerous to those who profited from conflict. The new patriarch, her nephew, and successor of Theophilus, proved even more aggressive than his uncle in expanding ecclesiastical power. His immediate targets were the Novatianists, a rigorous Christian sect whose churches he seized and whose bishop he expelled. Then he turned on Alexandria's Jewish community, using a dispute over Sabbath entertainments to launch a pogrom. Jewish homes were looted. Jewish families were driven from a city where they had lived for 7 centuries. The prefect Orestes, responsible for civil order, protested these violations of imperial authority. Cyril had exceeded his religious mandate by exercising what amounted to police power. The two men clashed repeatedly. When a mob of monks attacked Orestes' carriage, wounding him with a stone, the prefect had the perpetrator arrested and tortured to death. Relations between secular and religious authority collapsed entirely. Hypatia became a casualty of this political struggle. She was known to be close to Orestes, perhaps advising him. Rumors spread, almost certainly false, but eagerly believed that she used witchcraft to turn the prefect against the patriarch. To Cyril's supporters, she represented everything that prevented Christian triumph: classical learning, pagan philosophy, female authority, and friendship with the patriarch's enemies. In March of 415, during the season of Lent, when religious passions ran highest, a mob seized Hypatia as she traveled through the city. Led by a lector named Peter, they dragged her to a church called the Sever, once a pagan temple. There they stripped her naked and scraped the flesh from her bones with broken pottery shards and sharpened oyster shells. While she yet lived, they tore her limbs apart. Her remains were burned outside the city walls. The murder shocked the Roman world. Even contemporaries who shared Cyril's theological positions found the violence appalling. The church historian Socrates Scholasticus, himself a Christian, recorded the crime with evident horror, attributing it to hot-headed men who brought disgrace upon Alexandria and its patriarch. Yet Cyril faced no consequences. No imperial investigation occurred. No punishment was imposed. The lesson was unmistakable. Violence against philosophers carried no cost. Within decades, the remnants of Alexandria's schools had fallen silent. What teachers survived taught in whispers, if at all. The cursed legacy extended far beyond Egypt. The precedent established at Alexandria that religious authority could destroy secular learning with impunity echoed through medieval centuries. The final dissolution of Alexandrian scholarship proceeded not through dramatic violence, but gradual suffocation. After Hypatia's murder, no philosopher of comparable stature emerged from the city. The institutional infrastructure that had supported centuries of inquiry, the salaries, the housing, the libraries, the community of scholars, had been systematically dismantled. Individual brilliance cannot flourish without institutional support, and that support had been destroyed. The physical remains of Alexandria's intellectual heritage continued deteriorating for centuries. The Mausians' buildings fell into ruin, their stones carted away for other construction. The lighthouse, damaged by earthquakes, was eventually abandoned. Arab conquerors in 641 found a city that bore little resemblance to its ancient Gloria commercial port, still wealthy, but no longer a center of learning. Later legends would blame the Arabs for burning the library, but the destruction had occurred centuries earlier, perpetrated by the empire the Arabs had supplanted. What survived did so through circuitous routes. Syrian Christians translated Greek texts into Syriac. Persians welcomed refugee scholars, establishing academies where classical learning continued. Arab translators in Baghdad rendered Greek philosophy and science into Arabic, preserving works that would otherwise have vanished entirely. When medieval Europeans rediscovered Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Euclid, they often encountered these texts through Arabic translations of Syriac versions of Greek originals, a chain of transmission that testified both to what was saved and what was lost. The magnitude of the loss defies precise calculation. We know titles of works that no longer exist. We possess fragments quoted by later authors. We have references to books and entire libraries that vanished without trace. The astronomer Hipparchus wrote extensively, but only one minor work survives. Aristarchus's heliocentric theory is known only through later summaries. Of the estimated 500,000 to 700,000 scrolls once housed in Alexandria, virtually nothing remains in original form. Modern scholars have attempted to reconstruct what was lost by examining what survived. The gaps are staggering. Entire genres of Greek literature, most lyric poetry, most comedy, most historical writing exist only in fragments or not at all. Technical treatises on engineering, medicine, and mathematics that would have accelerated scientific progress by centuries were destroyed. The human cost cannot be measured in volumes alone. It must be reckoned in the additional millennia of disease, ignorance, and suffering that might have been averted had ancient knowledge been preserved. The responsibility for this catastrophe cannot be attributed to accident or warfare alone. Deliberate destruction by religious authorities, acting from sincere conviction that pagan learning was dangerous to souls, eliminated what fire and conquest had spared. Theophilus and Cyril believed they were serving God by destroying the works of godless philosophers. Their sincerity makes their actions no less tragic. Arguably, it makes them more so. Men convinced of their righteousness are capable of evils that mere cynics would hesitate to commit. Alexandria's fate offers lessons that resonate across centuries. The destruction of knowledge is rarely accomplished in single dramatic acts. It proceeds through accumulated attacks on institutions, scholars, and the social conditions that make inquiry possible.
Libraries burn.
But first, scholars are intimidated into silence. Funding is withdrawn, and students are discouraged from pursuing truth wherever it leads. The defense of learning requires constant vigilance. Every generation faces those who would subordinate knowledge to ideology, would burn books that contradict their certainties, who would silence voices that challenge their authority. Alexandria fell not because its defenders were too few, but because its attackers were utterly convinced of their righteousness. The fires have long since cooled. The scrolls have crumbled to dust. But the questions Alexandria posed about the nature of truth, the value of inquiry, the relationship between knowledge and power remain as urgent as ever. In remembering what was lost, we acknowledge an obligation to preserve what remains and to build anew what was destroyed. The smoke that rose over Alexandria in 391 has never fully cleared. It drifts through every subsequent century, a reminder of what humanity is capable of destroying and what we must never allow ourselves to forget.